The crowd was almost too thick to push through. The reporter grunted as she shoved her way to the gates outside Graceland. Through the bars, she saw the breathtaking white mansion stretch out before her.
Usually, the house looked peaceful, idyllic, and full of life. But today, it was at the center of a screaming mob of fans, policemen, and journalists. The curtains had been drawn and all the doors had been locked. Now, it just looked empty.
It had been hours since Elvis Presley was reported dead. But it seemed no one could believe it. It was impossible. Elvis was more than a man. He was an institution. He was larger than life. And now, he was dead, just like any other man.
The reporter strained to get a better view of the side of the house. She had missed all the action. There was nothing left to see except the mourners, who periodically erupted in wails.
Coming here had been a mistake. The reporter decided she should just turn around and leave. There was no story here anymore.
But just as she was turning to go, she caught a glimpse of a man walking out from behind the house. She blinked, and he was gone. But it hadn't been just her. The whole crowd had seen him. A mysterious man who looked a lot like Elvis Presley.
Welcome to Conspiracy Theories, a Parcast original. I'm Carter Roy.
And I'm Molly Brandenburg. Every Wednesday, we dig into the complicated stories behind the world's most controversial events and search for the truth.
Neither of us are conspiracy theorists.
But we are open-minded, skeptical, and curious. Don't get us wrong. Sometimes the official version is the truth.
But sometimes it's not.
You can find episodes of Conspiracy Theories and all other Parcast originals for free on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. To stream Conspiracy Theories for free on Spotify, just open the app, tap Browse, and type Conspiracy Theories in the search bar.
At Parcast, we are grateful for you, our listeners. You allow us to do what we love. Let us know how we're doing. Reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network.
And if you enjoy today's episode, the best way to help us is to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. It really does help.
Well, this is our first episode on the death of Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll and one of the best-selling solo artists in music history.
Elvis changed the face of music and pop culture forever. But his unprecedented fame came with pitfalls. He fell victim to loneliness and drug addiction and officially passed away in 1977 at the young age of 42.
But since then, he's been reportedly spotted all over the United States. Some fans believe the king never really died and instead went into hiding to escape the stresses of public life.
This week, we'll examine the rise and fall of Elvis Presley. We'll explore the circumstances that led to his supposed untimely death and the key people in his life at the time.
Next week, we'll examine why the death of Elvis has attracted the attention of conspiracy theorists. We'll discuss the theories on what could have happened to Elvis if he survived after 1977 and the clues that indicate he may still be alive today.
Elvis Aaron Presley rose from humble beginnings. He was born in Tupelo, Mississippi on January 8, 1935. He was a twin, but his brother, Jesse Presley, was stillborn.
Elvis's parents, Gladys and Vernon, were poor. They had trouble making ends meet and partially relied on government assistance to support the family. But Elvis was the apple of his parents' eyes, and they always ensured he had enough to get by. During his adolescence and into adulthood, he became very close to his mother, relying on her as a source of emotional support during his rise to fame.
In search of work, the Presley family moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1948, when Elvis was 13 years old. Though he had sung in church for years and had learned to play rudimentary guitar and tupelo, Elvis started to take music more seriously in Memphis.
He spent hours a day practicing guitar, and before he graduated high school, he was occasionally performing in public. When he was 18 years old in 1953, he got a day job driving a truck for an electrical company. He devoted all of his off time to singing and playing.
Later that year, Elvis went to the studios at Sun Records. He claimed he wanted to rent some time and record a couple of songs as a gift for his mother, who loved to hear him sing. But while there, he took the opportunity to try and make connections with other musicians. He asked the receptionist if she knew of any groups that were looking for a singer. When she asked what kind of singer he was, Elvis responded, "I don't sound like nobody."
After listening to Elvis record the songs for his mother, the receptionist passed his name on to the head of the studio, Sam Phillips. Phillips had long been searching for a white man who could sing like a black artist. In his words, if he could ever find such a singer, he would make $1 billion.
At the time, there was great prejudice against music written and performed by black musicians, especially in the American South. Radio stations with white DJs commonly refused to play music by black singers and groups. Few black performers were able to find success selling records to both black and white audiences.
But Sam Phillips, a white man, loved music by black musicians. He knew that if he could find a way to deliver music like that to white audiences, he would sell a ton of records. When he listened to Elvis's demo, he thought he may have found the singer he'd been searching for.
Still, the fact remained that Elvis's voice was largely untrained. Phillips called him back to the studio in 1954 when Elvis was 19. After hearing him sing again, Phillips felt Elvis had potential but needed more practice. He called in two experienced musicians, Scotty Moore and Bill Black, to help him find a good song for Elvis to record.
After hours of trial and error, Elvis performed the blues hit "That's All Right" by Arthur Crudup, a groundbreaking black singer and guitarist. Phillips found Elvis's rendition sensational. He sent the recording to a Memphis radio show, and within a few days, it became a local hit.
After the success of That's All Right, Elvis began touring in the southern United States. By the next year, 1955, he had become a star. Music promoter Colonel Tom Parker found Elvis captivating. The Colonel booked him on country musician Hank Snow's tour in February.
Tom Parker would come to play a huge role in Elvis's career, but he was a figure shrouded in mystery. Though the Colonel claimed to be from West Virginia, he was actually born in the Netherlands in 1909. Back then, his name was Andreas Cornelis van Kauk.
Parker got a job on the docks in Rotterdam when he was 16 years old, working on ships going from the Netherlands to America. Though it's never been conclusively proven, it's likely he jumped ship and immigrated to America at the age of 20, around 1929.
From there, Parker worked a variety of jobs, and the truth about his life story is largely unknown. At different times, he claimed to have served in the Army and worked at a carnival. At some point, though, Parker started working in music promotion. Elvis's manager considered the Colonel to be a marketing genius. He worked his magic fast. Soon, the Colonel had gotten Elvis booked on some high-profile tours, and he was subsequently promoted to be the singer's special advisor.
The tours propelled Elvis to new heights of fame. His performances got more sophisticated, fueled by his newfound confidence. At first, his legs twitched and his hips swayed as part of a nervous tic on stage. After noticing that some women in the audience swooned when he moved his hips, he refined his twitches into choreographed maneuvers. His hips gained him the screams of his fans, and the ire of jealous men.
Despite efforts by conservative religious figures to claim Elvis was leading teenage girls into sexual temptation, his popularity continued to soar. This was the beginning of what would become a lifelong problem for Elvis. It seemed like everybody either hated or loved him. No one could treat him as a normal person.
His fans worshipped the ground he walked on, while the worst of his critics treated him as an agent of the devil sent to morally corrupt children. At every concert he went to, he was followed by legions of angry detractors, sometimes so many that a police guard had to be hired.
Elvis's manager stated that teenage boys, jealous of their girlfriend's admiration of the singer, formed small groups and tried to jump him after performances.
Even in the early days of his fame, this was enough to make Elvis withdraw. To balance out the critics, he started deliberately surrounding himself with people who did whatever he asked. His behavior was encouraged by sycophantic friends who bent over backward to indulge his every whim.
Though it's important to note some of the descriptions of Elvis's behavior during this time were given far after the fact. It could be the case that some of these assessments were made in hindsight, and he didn't feel very personally isolated at the time.
Still, it's unquestionable that Elvis's inner circle closed quickly and tightly. He cultivated an environment where his word was law. To help him manage the demands of fame, Colonel Parker was always on call. It was thanks to the Colonel's constant work behind the scenes that Elvis secured an expensive contract with RCA and was promoted so heavily.
Over the next year, Elvis came to trust the Colonel more and more. By March of 1956, Elvis had appointed the Colonel as his personal manager.
Now, with total influence over music's biggest rising talent, he booked Elvis on a relentless tour and engineered a lucrative 7-year movie contract with Paramount.
Elvis was quickly becoming a phenomenon of national importance. He was in a different league than almost any other artist. At the end of 1956, his singles accounted for nearly half of RCA's single sales. RCA was a huge label, so it was no mean feat.
But his wide appeal was about to become a liability. In January of 1957, he turned 22 and got served a military draft notice. Though the U.S. was in a period of peace, a small percentage of men were drafted each year and were required to serve for a minimum of 2 years.
Serving in the military meant Elvis likely wouldn't be allowed to perform for at least 2 years. Most in the music industry considered the draft notice the end of his career. They were certain his popularity wouldn't survive a 2-year hiatus.
The Colonel, on the other hand, believed that if Elvis served and refused to accept special treatment, he could change his critics' minds and return to civilian life more famous than ever.
Well, the move was risky. It relied on Elvis keeping his fan base during the hiatus by stockpiling new songs and releasing them intermittently while he was deployed. A plan which could be catastrophic if the sound of popular music changed significantly in the next 2 years.
Even so, Elvis trusted the Colonel and agreed to his plan. In March of 1958, Elvis was sent to Fort Hood, Texas for training. Army life was difficult. He genuinely wanted to be seen as a regular soldier, but he was the most famous musician in the world.
Just like on the outside, many of his comrades were starstruck. They ogled him as he walked through the barracks. Those that were not fans gave him a wide berth, not ready to consider him one of their own.
It seemed that there was nowhere in the world Elvis Presley could go without facing the pressures of fame. At the same time, he constantly worried that his career as a musician was over.
In August of 1958, Elvis's mother, Gladys, was hospitalized after her liver failed. She had started drinking heavily from stress after Elvis was drafted and had been taking diet pills to lose weight.
It seems Elvis wasn't the only one who felt pressured by his stardom. His mother's obsession with her weight was brought on by tabloids. The combination of the pills with alcohol caused her to develop cirrhosis.
Elvis obtained leave from the Army and was by his mother's bedside when she died on August 14th at the age of 46. Just like that, the biggest source of support in his life was gone. He would try to fill that hole left behind with drugs, with drink, with money, and most of all, with women, but nothing would work. Elvis would spend the rest of his known life chasing a feeling of contentment that just wasn't there. Up next, Elvis tries to process his mother's death while dealing with the stresses of his military commitments and fame.
Before we get back to the show, I want to introduce a new Spotify original from Parcast called Incredible Feats. It's a short daily podcast hosted by comedian Dan Cummins. Every weekday, Dan explores an account of physical strength, mental focus, or bizarre behavior that's sure to leave at least some of you in pure disbelief. But there's no question these unbelievable stories are all true. Like the 350-mile nonstop run of Dean Karnazes back in 2005, and Jose Salvador Alvarenga's extraordinary tale of survival at sea. And let's not forget Annie Edson Taylor, the first person to go over the Niagara Falls in a barrel. Incredible Feats covers people and events that pushed boundaries, broke records, and revealed new sources of awe. It's offbeat entertainment that will send your mind reeling, so don't miss out. Follow Incredible Feats free on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the story. In 1958, 23-year-old Elvis Presley was struggling to adjust to life after the untimely death of his mother, Gladys. His public fame clashed with his desire to get back to his music as quickly and quietly as possible.
What made it worse was the feelings of guilt he felt after his mother died. She had passed at the young age of 46 because of liver problems caused by heavy drinking and diet pills. Elvis was forced to wonder, if he hadn't been the most famous musician on the planet, would she have been under so much stress?
Of course, in reality, Gladys loved her son and was overjoyed with his success. Elvis supported both her and his father and worked tirelessly to improve their lives. But immediately following Gladys's death, his friendships were frayed by jealousy, and family and friends regularly came to him for favors and financial help. Was any of this fame worth his mother's life?
Elvis was at the lowest he had ever been. Even so, he wasn't allowed to take more than a week's leave from military service. Right after his mother's funeral, he was deployed to West Germany in September 1958.
In Germany, he became a driver for a platoon sergeant. Getting used to the demands of the army, especially fresh off his mother's death, was hard. But soon, he was afforded some special privileges which made it all a little more bearable.
Though the entire idea of his enlisting was to live as a regular soldier, it was functionally impossible for him to do that completely. Fans mobbed him wherever he went, even in Germany.
Even the Army realized that having him at the base full-time would be counterproductive. He was allowed to live off base and rented out the entire top floor of a fancy hotel. He then set about filling the rooms with people he felt he could trust.
He flew out his father, grandmother, and two of his friends, Red West and Lamar Fike, to come stay with him. He also recruited a personal barber, dentist, and a driver. As was his tendency, he was creating a separate, insular world away from the responsibilities of the outside.
At the hotel, he was the boss. Even his father couldn't tell him what to do. After all, He was the one paying for everyone to be there. He made use of his authority and had his friends pick up his dry cleaning and press his army uniforms.
He was generous with his money and time, but also didn't take kindly when people refused to do what he asked. His usual rejoinder was, "You don't like it? There's the door."
His mood swings put everyone around him on edge. Everyone knew he was dealing with a lot of stress, and so they learned to act unfailingly upbeat around him.
Because Elvis supported them financially, his friends and even his father were at his mercy. He used the money to manipulate them when they questioned him or didn't do what he asked. If there was one thing Elvis hated, it was being told no.
On the other hand, his moodiness was balanced by moments of extreme generosity. He donated money to buy extra equipment and trips home for his fellow soldiers. He also frequently did favors for his friends and acquaintances.
But even Elvis couldn't handle everything. After all, he was still living in a foreign country, trying to grieve his mother, managing his absentee music career, and performing his duties as a GI. It was all too much.
But one day, while practicing Army maneuvers at the base, he received the solution to his chronic exhaustion. A sergeant noticed that he was on the verge of collapse and offered him an amphetamine tablet to stay alert. Elvis's decision to take the pill would have repercussions for the rest of his life.
At the time, the side effects of amphetamine pills were not well understood. Many in the medical community considered them to be miracle drugs. The sergeant told Elvis the drugs gave him boundless energy, and the only side effect was a dry mouth. He also said they worked to suppress his appetite, which won Elvis over. He had always been image conscious and, like his mother, worried about his weight.
It didn't take long for the pills to become part of Elvis's everyday routine. They allowed him to stay up as late as he needed to and still have energy to spare on the weekends. They helped him stay cheerful when interacting with fans and energetic during Army exercises.
He convinced many other soldiers to try them and insisted his friends Red and Lamar get in on the action as well. This was just another requirement of the job. Being a member of Elvis's entourage meant you did what he wanted, you liked what he liked, and you didn't ask questions.
Thanks to his endless money and fame, Elvis seemed capable of anything. He got a generous prescription for amphetamines from a doctor and took advantage of every special privilege he was offered by the Army.
A month after his mother's death, Elvis finally felt that he had retaken some control over his life. He had a place that felt like home in West Germany. With his secretary Elizabeth, he had a close female companion to supplement his weekly one-night stands.
The only thing he lacked was the deep emotional support his mother had provided. For this, he turned back to the colonel. Elvis wrote to his manager almost daily. The colonel sent back messages of support and kept Elvis in the loop about his business dealings. Not that Elvis was particularly interested in the details of the business. As long as he had some money and fans, he didn't mind leaving the rest of it to Colonel Parker.
The colonel took this tacit encouragement and ran with it. He made it his mission to keep Elvis happy while he was deployed. He sent Elvis pep talks by mail where he told him that the entire country was proud of him for doing his duty as a soldier. He spent hours on end promising Elvis that his career still had life in it and making the arrangements to keep his fans content.
He spent so much time on Elvis that he didn't take on a single other client, even while Elvis was abroad.
Thanks to his unflagging efforts, Elvis began to think of the colonel as the one person he could truly rely on. On the other hand, he argued with members of his entourage who thought he was becoming an arrogant big shot.
By 1959, a year into Elvis's 2-year deployment, his friend Red West had reached a breaking point. He felt Elvis threw his fame around to get special treatment and didn't like how the amphetamines made Elvis loud and excitable at all hours of the night.
Red tried to confront Elvis about his behavior, but the discussion only devolved into a shouting match. In May, Red went back home to the States. He was quickly replaced by another one of Elvis's friends, Cliff Gleaves.
Elvis wasn't short on potential dates either. One of the main duties of his entourage had become to recruit women around town to go on dates with him. In August of 1959, 14-year-old Priscilla found herself on a date with the now 24-year-old Elvis. That evening, she came to a party at a house Elvis was renting in Friedberg, Germany.
As was usual on his first dates, Elvis sang for her and introduced her to his kindly grandmother. He was surprised by her young age, but wasn't deterred. He treated her courteously, and at the end of the night, he asked her to come back again.
On their second date, Elvis spent some time with her in his bedroom. Priscilla was nervous, but it wasn't what she'd expected. Elvis just sat next to her on the bed and talked with her for a few hours.
Not long after that, the pair started seeing each other almost every night. Elvis's friends were perplexed at his intense interest in Priscilla. He didn't normally get that close with women.
Elvis didn't have much of an explanation, other than to say that he found her beautiful and unusually easy to talk to.
Eventually, they started sleeping in the same bed together, though according to Priscilla, she and Elvis did not have intercourse. Their time together grew even more intense.
But it was also short-lived. Elvis's deployment ended in 1960, and he left Priscilla in West Germany while he went on a comeback tour in the United States. Priscilla assumed she would never see him again, but Elvis promised they would have a future together.
But that was still a far-off dream. In the short term, Elvis was concerned with getting back home. When his plane landed back in the States, he received a screaming reception from thousands of fans at the airport. He could hardly believe it. The Colonel's plan had worked. Elvis was back and bigger than ever. But soon he would learn that the higher he climbed, the further he had to fall.
Up next, Elvis yields to pressure on all sides, leading to a growing internal emptiness.
Now, back to the story.
Everybody in old Santa Claus was dancing to the jailhouse rock.
In 1960, 25-year-old Elvis Presley returned home after a 2-year military deployment in Germany. He worried that his career would be over after being away for so long, but thanks to the expert management of Colonel Parker, he came back more popular than ever. Since songs had been slowly eked out over the course of Elvis's hiatus, the fans clamored for more.
Elvis gave them what they wanted. But after his comeback, he shifted his primary focus to acting. For the next several years, he starred in a spate of popular films, including G.I. Blues and Blue Hawaii. None required very deep performances, but most performed well at the box office.
At first, Elvis had ambitions of pursuing some big dramatic roles, but his more serious movies did not sell as well. Meanwhile, the Colonel was always in his ear, persuading him to go back to fluffier, more formulaic parts.
But just because the films weren't emotionally demanding didn't mean Elvis wasn't working hard. He was on set 12 hours a day and toured in between roles. He always showed up on time and did his job as well as he could. But the nonstop traveling and performing wore him out.
The only thing that sustained him were the amphetamines. By now, he was taking them constantly.
Unfortunately, the non-stop drug intake made Elvis irritable, and his temper grew shorter than ever before.
Once, on a road trip with his entourage, another driver flipped Elvis off as he drove by. Elvis responded by commanding his driver to speed up.
When they caught up to the guy who had flipped them off, Elvis pulled a Derringer pistol from his jacket and waved it around. The rest of his entourage had to rush to calm him down. There was a genuine tension in the car until Elvis finally holstered the weapon and smiled as if nothing had happened.
Another temper flare occurred while Elvis was playing pool with his friend Sonny. A woman who was visiting wanted to leave the house, but Sonny's car was blocking her in. She asked Sonny if he could move his car, and Elvis told her to ask someone else, since they were in the middle of a game.
Well, the woman didn't know anyone else in the house, so after a few minutes of wondering what to do, she asked Sonny again. Elvis suddenly exploded in rage and threw his pool stick at her.
Meanwhile, the state of his professional career wasn't exactly helping his mood. At the Colonel's directive, he was only performing songs to accompany movies because these songs were the most profitable and easy to arrange. For years, these soundtracks comprised almost all of Elvis's musical output.
Elvis didn't particularly like the generic work, but he was convinced by the Colonel that it was what his fans wanted.
After all, it continued to sell well. Elvis ultimately allowed himself to be convinced that his job was to make music that sold as much as possible.
But that left him searching for fulfillment in other areas. Since he had returned to the U.S. in 1960, he had been writing regular letters to Priscilla. In 1962, at the age of 27, Elvis decided that since Priscilla was almost 18, the time was right for him to see her again.
He flew the now 17-year-old out to Memphis from Germany twice that year. All this time, he had been thinking about her in his lowest moments and worked hard to impress her when she visited. For her part, Priscilla was still head over heels for him. Elvis had groomed her to see him as a kind of mythical figure, and she was determined to do whatever it took to stay in his good graces.
Elvis gave her amphetamine so she could keep up with him and his entourage, and sleeping pills so she could come back down again. One day she was feeling unnaturally anxious. Elvis gave her 2 big red pills and said they were to calm her down. She slept for 2 straight days. When she awoke, she found a terrified Elvis standing over her. He thought she was in a coma and was going to die.
Priscilla dealt with the situation with poise, as always. No matter the obstacle, she was determined to be what Elvis wanted. After her second visit, Elvis negotiated with her parents, who finally agreed to allow her to finish her senior year of high school in Memphis.
But Priscilla's new life in Tennessee was not exactly a dream come true. Elvis was out of the state shooting movies for most of the time. She lived at the Graceland mansion with Elvis's father and his wife. They instituted strict rules, which she resented. She hated the fact that she still had to go to school, too. She was always waiting for Elvis to come back home.
When he was back, things got better. She was allowed a lot more freedom, and Elvis doted on her. She and Elvis slept in the same bed every night, but Priscilla claimed they still didn't have sex. Elvis was waiting for the right time, he said. He wanted it to be perfect.
He also wanted her to be perfect. As always, Elvis sought devotion and loyalty over everything else. He consciously shaped Priscilla into the kind of woman he wanted her to be.
He bought her fancy clothes and gave her directions to improve her looks. He hired a dentist to put porcelain over her teeth and dyed her hair black so that it looked more like his own. He also subjected her to hours of lectures on how his ideal woman should behave.
But above all, the biggest thing he demanded of Priscilla was that she keep up with his rock and roll lifestyle. She didn't really want to take the uppers and downers he gave her, but to reject the pills would be to reject Elvis himself. He wouldn't slow down for anyone.
The prospect of going through the day without taking pills no longer even entered Elvis's mind. He thought they were harmless and often told Priscilla that his own doctor had prescribed them. He promised her they were nothing like hard drugs.
Priscilla eventually took the pills, but it was still difficult for a young woman to navigate the bizarre, hermetic world Elvis had created. She was constantly surrounded by older men who didn't know how to interact with her. Elvis got jealous when anyone talked to Priscilla at all, so his entourage mostly ignored her.
Meanwhile, Elvis gradually became more distant. He still disliked his own musical output and was getting bored with the paint-by-numbers films he was cast in. He fought his internal emptiness by spending impulsively. He bought motorcycles, custom motorhomes, anything to keep him distracted.
Elvis also made powerful friends. Eventually, his charm and lasting influence won over even the most reluctant, including conservative government figures.
But all the diversions and contacts in the world ultimately didn't lessen the burdens of his personal life.
Priscilla, now 22 years old, was getting more assertive and was adamant that they should get married soon.
Elvis loved Priscilla, but also liked being a bachelor. All this time, he had continued to date women behind Priscilla's back. But finally, he bowed to the pressure and proposed just before Christmas in 1966.
Unfortunately, the months leading up to the wedding were not exactly happy ones. Elvis's drug issues and feelings of emptiness started to spill over from his personal life into his professional one.
Up until 1967, that had never been a problem. No matter how disappointed he was in whatever film he was in, Elvis had always behaved himself on set. But all of a sudden, he felt like a laughingstock. He couldn't bring himself to get out of bed and had taken to binge eating and drug consumption to get himself through the days.
He was overweight, strung out, and his hair looked terrible, like a wig. With Elvis's profits now in danger, the Colonel finally stepped in. He summoned the members of Elvis's crew and gave them an earful.
He even fired a few of them, and Elvis didn't defend any of his companions.
After that confrontation, Elvis returned to keeping his obligations. He married Priscilla in May of 1967. They had a month-long honeymoon, and the two grew closer than they had ever been before.
Priscilla's bliss was interrupted when she learned she was pregnant. She became terrified the pregnancy would make her undesirable to Elvis.
Elvis, for his part, was euphoric at the news. He couldn't wait for his daughter's birth. On February 1st of 1968, Lisa Marie Presley was born.
But after the baby's birth, Priscilla's worst fears were confirmed. Elvis claimed it was impossible for him to be sexually attracted to a woman with a child.
No matter what she did, he refused to become intimate with Priscilla for months after their daughter was born. The rejection lowered her self-esteem considerably. By 1969, her relationship with Elvis had grown incredibly distant. Then, that year, he embarked on a comeback tour after a successful TV special.
With Elvis away from home touring, their relationship soured even more. Priscilla knew Elvis had been cheating on her for years, and she was desperate for emotional support. In 1971, she had an affair with a karate teacher named Mike Stone.
The affair continued for months, until Priscilla officially filed for separation in February of 1972. Learning about the affair took Elvis by surprise. For a while, he genuinely couldn't understand what had pushed Priscilla away.
After this, Elvis became even more depressed and fell deeper into drug addiction and binge eating.
In the following 4 years, he continued to tour, but his professionalism was long gone. He didn't treat anyone well except for his doctors, who injected him with special cocktails of uppers and downers that allowed him to get through the day.
Eventually, he needed the injections multiple times a day just to be able to get up and move around. His medical problems became severe, and he secluded himself in his bedroom in 1977 at the age of 42.
He saw only his doctors and the occasional girlfriend, but somewhat incomprehensibly, despite his deteriorating health, Elvis still thought he could make another return to public life.
He planned to take a plane to Memphis and begin another tour on August 16, 1977.
The tour would never come to pass. In retrospect, it seems bizarre that if Elvis's health really was so dire, he would commit to a major tour.
Even so, that's apparently what he did. That morning, he woke up dazed and aching, like he always did. He had taken 2 shots of a drug cocktail before noon, which gave him the energy to walk around.
But after only a few hours, he needed a 3rd injection. He then told his girlfriend, Ginger Alden, that he was going into the bathroom to read. He didn't come back out, and after a while, Ginger went to check on him. She found him on the floor in a puddle of his own vomit.
A doctor was called, but there was nothing he could do. Elvis was dead. He passed away with a clogged colon, an overworked heart, and 14 different drugs in his system.
But for some, this wasn't the end of the story. Soon after Elvis supposedly died, and in the decades since, legions of fans have claimed to have spotted the king all around the United States and even in movies.
Our first conspiracy claims that Elvis faked his own death as a way to escape his fame. It's undeniable that his popularity was at the root of many of his personal problems. Could he have arranged the overdose as a cover-up and flown to Bermuda to get away from it all?
Our second conspiracy targets a specific man, still alive today, who bears a striking physical and musical resemblance to the star. Instead of going to Bermuda, could Elvis instead have retreated to Arkansas? Given his strong Christian faith, might he have started a new life as a pastor?
Our third conspiracy focuses on a different Elvis sighting. Adherents often believe Elvis has been secretly communicating the fact that he's alive to fans since his supposed death. Could one of these clues have shown up in the 1990 family movie, Home Alone? Could Elvis be the mysterious extra who was featured in a scene at the beginning of the film?
Throughout his life, Elvis constantly surprised his critics. His talent, charisma, and work ethic led him to dominate the music industry in ways no one thought possible.
His fame may have caused his collapse, but if there's one thing Elvis proved during his life, it was that he should never be underestimated. Whether or not he continues to live on, his legacy endures.
Thanks for tuning in to Conspiracy Theories. We'll be back on Wednesday with a new episode. In part 2, we'll look into whether the king of rock and roll could have faked his own death. You can find all episodes of Conspiracy Theories and all other Parcast originals for free on Spotify.
Not only does Spotify already have all your favorite music, but now Spotify is making it easy for you to enjoy all of your favorite Parcast originals, like Conspiracy Theories, for free from your phone, desktop, or smart speaker.
To stream Conspiracy Theories on Spotify, just open the app, tap Browse, and type Conspiracy Theories in the search bar.
Until then, remember, the truth isn't always the best story.
And the official story isn't always the truth. Conspiracy Theories was created by Max Cutler, is a production of Cutler Media, and is part of the Parcast Network. It is produced by Max and Ron Cutler, sound designed by Andy Waits, with production assistance by Ron Shapiro and Paul Mahler. Additional production assistance by Maggie Admire and Carly Madden. This episode of Conspiracy Theories was written by Tara Wells and stars Molly Brandenburg and Carter Roy.
Remember to follow incredible feats for mind-reeling stories of strength, focus, and achievement. Comedian and podcaster Dan Cummins hosts, bringing his signature humor to these extreme accounts. You might be glad you've never lived these stories, but you'll love hearing them. Follow Incredible Feats free on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.